The night descends slowly over the medieval countryside, wrapping the fields, cottages, and pathways in a deep, muted stillness. Far from the bustling castles and the candlelit feasts of lords, the peasant village rests beneath a sky strewn with stars. The air carries the faint scent of wood smoke, mingled with the earthy aroma of damp soil and livestock bedding down for the night. Crickets sing in uneven rhythms, and somewhere in the distance a dog barks once before falling quiet again. This is the rhythm of a world without clocks or lamps, where the rising and setting of the sun alone guides the pace of life. Along the main track, ruts carved deep by wooden cartwheels are slowly filling with water from the day's rainfall. The mud glistens faintly in the moonlight, and the sound of footsteps squelching through it has long ceased. The villagers have retreated to their homes, small timber-framed cottages with thatched roofs patched over many years with straw and reeds gathered from nearby fields. Smoke curls lazily from chimney holes, carrying with it the comforting promise of warmth within. Inside one such cottage, a single fire burns low in the hearth, its orange glow flickering against rough, plastered walls. Shadows dance across bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, their scents mixing with that of cooking porridge left in a clay pot near the embers. The crackling fire is not just a source of heat, but a lifeline, the heart of the home where meals are cooked, stories are told, and repairs, both to tools and to garments, are carried out. At the side of the hearth, a peasant sits hunched upon a low stool, his tunic, worn thin from countless days in the fields, has torn along the sleeve. It is a simple woolen garment, coarse and rough to the touch, dyed with the muted colors of natural plants. There is no second tunic waiting in a chest. This one must last as long as possible. The tear is small now, but if left unrepaired, it will widen, and the garment may unravel further. In a life where every item is precious, even the smallest damage feels like a looming threat. He turns the fabric in his hands, eyes narrowing in the dim light. A needle would solve the problem swiftly, thread pushed neatly through the fibers, drawing the torn edges back together. But a needle, small though it may seem, is a luxury he cannot afford. In wealthier households, they are forged by skilled metal workers and treasured like silver coins. For a peasant, acquiring one might take months of saving or sheer luck at the market. Tonight no such tool lies within his reach. This moment is familiar across countless homes. In cottage after cottage, peasants confront the same dilemma: how to hold together clothing that must withstand not just one season but years of labor. Clothes are not discarded when torn, they are not replaced at whim. Instead they are nursed along, patched, reinforced, and reinvented, until the original garment becomes nearly unrecognizable beneath layers of mending. Each tear is not an end but the beginning of new work, an opportunity to practice patience, creativity, and sheer necessity. Outside the village, all is quiet, but inside these humble rooms, life is still at work. A mother stitches together her child's hose using a cord twisted from hemp. An elder, long past his fieldworking years, shows a grandchild how to bind scraps of wool into a sleeve. A woman, widowed and alone, mends her cloak with strips of leather, her gnarled hands working slowly in the firelight. These scenes repeat themselves in thousands of cottages across medieval Europe, echoing the rhythm of a society that must survive with little. The fire pops, and sparks leap for an instant before fading into ash. The man sighs, then reaches for a small bundle of fibers beside him. They are coarse strands of flax, pulled from the plant and spun into rough thread, not nearly as fine as what a professional weaver might create, but strong enough to hold torn wool together for a time. He twists them tighter, creating a cord. Without a needle, he must guide it carefully, knotting it into the fabric, looping it through holes made with the tip of a bone shard. Slowly, deliberately, the garment begins to close. It is not beautiful work. The seam is uneven, the knots bulky, and the repair will always show. But beauty is not the aim here, survival is. Every peasant understands that garments must be treated with respect, for they guard against wind, rain, and cold as surely as walls guard against wolves. The tunic, once mended, will return to the fields with him tomorrow, enduring sweat, soil, and the brush of coarse straw. It will not be perfect, but it will be enough. In the broader silence of the village, this act of mending may seem small, even invisible, yet it represents the heartbeat of peasant life, quiet resilience in the face of scarcity. Where others see lack, Peasants learned to see possibility, a thorn as a substitute needle, a strand of hemp as thread, a patch cut from an older rag to strengthen the weak spot of another. Theirs is a world held together not by abundance but by ingenuity. As the man ties off the final knot, the firelight glints faintly on his roughened hands. He places the repaired tunic beside him, and leans back, listening to the night sounds outside, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind against the thatch, the quiet breathing of his family asleep in the shadows. His eyes close for a moment, heavy with the day's labor. Yet in this small act of repair, there is a sense of peace. The garment will endure a while longer, and so will he. Thus begins our journey into a forgotten world, a world where every stitch, every knot, and every patch told a story. Tonight we step into the lives of those who had little but created much, who lived without the luxury of tools we now take for granted, and who found dignity in the simplest act of keeping a tunic whole. Their story unfolds not in great battles or royal halls, but in cottages like this, where the glow of a hearth and the resilience of hands shape the fabric of survival. In the medieval world, clothing for peasants was never chosen with style in mind. There were no mirrors hung on cottage walls, no seasonal fashions arriving with merchants, and no time for vanity amid the unending cycle of planting and harvest. For the poor, every garment was a shield, a fragile layer of protection against a world that could be unforgiving. Clothing was survival itself, stitched and patched together not to impress but to endure. The peasant's wardrobe was astonishingly small, where a noble might own dozens of gowns, robes and cloaks, carefully tailored and dyed in rich colors. A peasant could count his possessions on one hand: a single tunic, perhaps two, if fortune allowed, a pair of hose that would be worn until the knees burst open, a cloak heavy enough to face the biting winds of winter, and boots or shoes often inherited, sometimes fashioned from scraps of leather, repaired until they resembled more patch than original skin. The contrast is almost painful to imagine. One world draped in silk and velvet, the other wrapped in coarse wool and hemp. Every piece of clothing carried weight beyond its fabric. A tunic was not just a tunic, it was warmth on a frostbitten morning, dignity when standing in the crowded church on Sundays, and the only barrier between skin and the rough chafing of farm work. To lose a garment or to let it fall into ruin was unthinkable. Replacing it was not a simple matter of visiting a shop. For the peasant, markets were rare events, and cloth itself was costly. Weeks of labor in the fields might buy only a few yards of wool, and even then it was often coarse, unrefined, and heavy. The memory of winters loomed large in every household. A bitter cold could kill as surely as hunger. Villagers wrapped themselves in layers, not for elegance but for sheer survival. Old rags were tied beneath cloaks, scraps of cloth were bound around feet in place of socks, and heads were covered with whatever fabric could be spared. In these months mending was constant. A cloak torn in December could mean suffering in January. Peasants understood this with a clarity that modern life often forgets. Clothing was as essential as food and just as fragile. When garments wore thin, they were never discarded. Instead, they passed through a cycle of rebirth. A father's tunic, after years of repair, might become his son's. Later, when too tattered for daily wear, it might be cut into patches to mend another garment. Eventually, when the fabric was little more than rags, it served as padding for shoes, stuffing for bedding, or strips of binding for tools. Nothing was wasted. Each fiber gave its service until nothing remained. In this way, a single garment could live several lives, carrying the imprint of multiple generations. Imagine for a moment standing in the center of such a household. Around the hearth, clothing hangs from wooden pegs driven into the walls, cloaks smelling faintly of smoke, hose stiff with mud and sweat, and linen undergarments drying after being scrubbed in icy water. None of it is bright, none of it new. Browns, greys, and faded greens dominate, the colors of earth and plants. Dyes were too costly, too precious to be wasted on peasant clothes. Even when garments were dyed, the colors were muted: the pale blue of woad, the dull yellow of onion skin, the dark gray of soot. Children often went without shoes, their feet toughened against stone and frost. In summer they might run half-clothed, wearing only a smock or a simple shift. In winter they wrapped themselves in whatever scraps could be spared, shivering but enduring. For the elderly, clothing carried even greater importance. For their bodies, frail and weakened, could not endure the cold without heavy layers. Every stitch, every knot of thread, was a small act of protection against the relentless turning of the seasons. For peasants, the social meaning of clothing was also deeply felt. On Sundays or feast days when the village gathered at the church, even the poorest families tried to present their best garments. A patched cloak was brushed clean, a frayed tunic, carefully adjusted, a belt tightened to hold the worn cloth neatly. Though peasants could not match the splendor of nobles, they still held dignity in appearing decently. A family that managed to keep its clothes in good condition, no matter how simple, commanded respect in the community. In this way, mending was not only about survival, it was about pride, identity, and belonging. Contrast this with the life of nobles, who could afford entire wardrobes crafted by skilled tailors. Their fabrics were soft, their colors bright, and their garments changed with the seasons. They dressed for display, for power, for fashion. Peasants dressed for endurance, for weather, for labor. The difference was not simply visible, it was symbolic of the divide that structured medieval society. Yet even in this divide, there is a quiet beauty in the peasant's approach. For while noble garments lived and died with the trends of fashion, the clothing of peasants lived on through memory, resilience, and necessity. Consider the stories embedded in a single patched tunic, each fray repaired, each hole covered, each stitch placed by a hand with a purpose. A tear from climbing a ladder, patched with wool from an old cloak, a sleeve ripped in harvest, bound with hemp cord spun in the long winter evenings, a patch cut from a grandmother's shift, sewn into the garment of her grandson. The fabric becomes a history book, its chapters written not in ink but in thread. Listening to its silent record, one hears the rhythm of toil, the endurance of hunger, the warmth of family bonds. Even the act of wearing clothes bore hardship. Rough wool itched against the skin, hose tightened around the legs, restricting movement. Cloaks weighed heavy when wet with rain. Yet peasants bore it all, because these garments were lifelines. They were not chosen but endured, carried like burdens and blessings at once. And each time they were repaired, whether by knot, patch, or binding, they grew into something more than mere fabric. They became symbols of survival, of human ingenuity under constraint. In the quiet of the village, when fires dimmed and families rested, these garments lay folded or hung upon pegs, waiting for the next day's labor. They were not beautiful by any courtly measure, but they were beautiful in their resilience. To look at them was to see not only wool and flax, but the unyielding will of the people who wore them. For peasants, clothing was never fashion, it was survival, and survival in those times was everything. To modern eyes, a needle seems an ordinary thing, small, slender, and nearly weightless. It is the sort of tool easily overlooked, often bought in packets, tossed into drawers, forgotten until needed. Yet in the world of peasants centuries ago, a single needle was no trivial object. It was treasure, it was rarity, it was the difference between a garment's survival and its slow unraveling. In many villages, a needle was so valued that it was guarded as carefully as coin. The making of needles was a craft unto itself. In early centuries, they were fashioned from bone or wood, carved carefully to pierce cloth. But true metal needles, those fine enough to slip through tough fabric and strong enough to last, required iron or steel, and the skill of a smith. Blacksmiths busy with plows, horseshoes, and weapons, rarely devoted their energy to such delicate work. When they did, the result was costly. For peasants who counted every penny and bartered for every necessity, such a purchase was far beyond easy reach. Imagine a market day. The muddy square is filled with traders, baskets of apples, sacks of barley, tools of wood and iron, bolts of coarse cloth. Among these goods, a traveling peddler might display a small collection of needles. They gleam faintly in the pale sun, slender slivers of iron, arranged upon a scrap of cloth. To the wealthy townsfolk or the steward of a noble household, they are convenient purchases, but to a peasant wife standing barefoot with a handful of eggs to barter, the price is staggering. To part with food for the sake of a tool, this is a decision that could mean hunger at week's end. Often the needle remains on the peddler's cloth, admired but unattainable. Those who managed to acquire one treated it almost like an heirloom. It was stored in small wooden boxes, or wrapped in cloth to keep it safe from rust. Losing a needle was unthinkable, and yet because of its size, it was heartbreakingly easy. A single slip into straw flooring, a tumble into mud, and the tool might vanish forever. Stories were told of women spending hours on their knees, combing through rushes on the floor with their fingers, praying to find a missing needle. Some even carried charms, asking saints for help in retrieving the precious object. Most peasants never possessed such a tool. Instead, they relied on improvisation, developing ingenious methods to mend cloth without ever touching a real needle. Horners, awls, sharpened bones, all became substitutes. In this way, the absence of the needle became a force that shaped daily life, driving peasants to new levels of creativity. Yet the longing for such an item never faded. To own a needle was to possess a kind of quiet power, the ability to bind cloth smoothly, to make neat stitches, to mend garments in ways that looked almost professional. The social divide was evident even in this small detail. Nobles and townsfolk often had boxes of needles, pins and fine threads, tended by professional tailors or household servants. Their garments were maintained in secrecy, hidden away in chambers where skilled hands worked swiftly. The stitches were straight, the seams invisible. A noble's tunic looked as flawless on its 100th wearing as on its first. The peasants, by contrast, wore garments whose repairs shouted their presence. Uneven knots, visible patches, cord bindings, they announced the struggle and resourcefulness of the poor. One world concealed its work, the other wore it openly. But scarcity did not mean shame. In many villages, the patchwork tunic mended without a needle became a badge of endurance. It was a garment that spoke of clever hands, of patience, of a family's refusal to surrender to poverty. Though peasants admired the smooth seams of noble garments, they also understood that their own methods carried stories no tailor's work could match. A torn sleeve bound with hemp cord was evidence of labor in the fields. A patched cloak stitched with sinew was a reminder of nights spent by the fire, spinning scraps into new life. In this way, the absence of needles gave rise to a culture of visible history, written upon cloth itself. The needle also became a symbol in folk tales and superstitions. In some regions, to dream of a needle was to dream of fortune, for it meant that repair and renewal were possible. In others, giving away a needle without payment was thought unlucky, for it might cut the bond between friends. The object's scarcity gave it weight, transforming it from simple tool into emblem. Stories told around the hearth often carried warnings: guard your tools, for they are gifts from God, and treat them with reverence. Consider the story of one family, passed down through oral tradition. A woman in a small hamlet was said to have inherited a metal needle from her grandmother. It was the only needle in the village. She used it sparingly, lending it to neighbors when their garments were too far gone for thorns and knots. In time, the needle came to be known by name, spoken of as though it were alive. When it finally broke after decades of use, the villagers mourned it like the death of a friend. Though perhaps exaggerated, such tales capture the intensity of value placed on these slivers of iron. The rarity of needles also meant that professional sewing, true tailoring, was a distant dream for most peasants. Clothes were simple, made in basic shapes, designed for practicality. Without fine needles, peasants did not indulge in complicated seams or intricate patterns. Their garments were rough, but they lasted. The elegance of fashion belonged to another world entirely. And yet from this lack, something enduring was born. The ingenuity developed by peasants in the absence of needles shaped traditions of repair that lasted centuries. Skills of knotting, binding and patching became as essential as baking bread or planting seed. Children grew up watching their mothers and grandmothers improvise tools, and they learned to see resourcefulness as strength. The very scarcity of the needle taught generations to rely on their wits rather than their wealth. As the centuries rolled on, needles did become more common. Iron production expanded, trade routes grew, and the tools slowly filtered down into more households. But even as they did, the old methods survived. Habit and tradition are slow to fade. Peasants who had lived without needles for generations carried their skills proudly, teaching them as part of daily life. In some villages, even when a needle could be bought, peasants still repaired garments with knots and thorns, simply because it was the way things had always been done. Thus the needle stands in history not only as a tool of sewing, but as a marker of class, of scarcity, and of creativity under constraint. To own one was privilege. To lack one was challenge. But in the hands of the poor, the lack gave rise to ingenuity that shaped a culture of endurance. The story of clothing without needles is at its heart a story of human adaptation, a reminder that even the smallest objects can alter the course of daily life. In the quiet cottages of medieval villages, where firelight flickered and wind rattled the shutters, the absence of a needle was felt keenly. Yet from that absence came 1,000 acts of invention, binding together not just garments but families, communities, and traditions. The needle was priceless, but its absence paradoxically created a legacy far richer than iron. Before peasants could repair their clothes without needles, they first needed something to act as thread. In a world without abundance, this meant turning not to markets or workshops, but to the very earth itself. Nature became their supplier, and the fields, rivers, and forests provided the fibers that bound torn garments together. To the modern ear, thread is so common as to be invisible, but for peasants, even the smallest cord of fiber was an achievement. Something spun, twisted, and shaped with patience and skill. The most familiar of these fibers was flax. Hardy and reliable, flax plants grew well in poor soil, their tall stalks swaying in the summer winds. While wealthier households might use flax to make linen cloth, peasants often worked with the plant in cruder ways. By soaking, beating, and combing the stalks, they teased out fibers that could be spun into rough thread. It was not the smooth, gleaming linen of noble garments, but it was strong enough to tie together the edges of a cloak or hold a patch onto a tunic. The process was long and messy, yet it transformed humble stalks into lifelines. Hemp was another gift from the fields. Tough and wiry, its fibers were more difficult to work but produced cords of impressive strength. Peasants prized hemp for tasks beyond clothing, ropes for animals, bindings for tools, cords for buckets. But scraps and thin strands were often diverted toward garment repair. A tunic sleeve could be laced together with hemp cord, creating a seam as sturdy as the fields demanded. Though rough against the skin, it did the job, and that was enough. Hemp carried with it the smell of earth and sweat, as if the fields themselves had been woven into the garment. In places where flax and hemp were scarce, peasants turned to nettles. The stinging plant, avoided in gardens for its painful touch, became an unlikely ally. When carefully harvested, soaked, and stripped, nettles yielded long, silky fibers that could be spun into usable thread. Many peasants learned to see past the sting to the treasure within. The transformation was almost magical. A weed that burned the skin became the very material that saved a cloak or hose from falling apart. Around hearth fires, women spun nettle fibers, their hands working rhythmically as children listened to stories. In the quiet crackle of flames, nettles became hope. Woven into cord, animals too offered their gifts. Sinew, the strong tendon taken from deer, boar, or oxen, could be dried, split, and twisted into thread. Hunters returning from the forest often brought not only meat but also this vital material, which found its way into shoes, cloaks, and bags. Sinew was remarkably durable, able to withstand strain and weather better than plant fibers. When a shepherd bound his leggings with sinew, he trusted them to endure long days in the fields. In this way, the bond between human and animal extended beyond food and labor into the very fibers that clothed the body. Wool too provided makeshift thread. When garments frayed, peasants pulled at the loose fibers, twisting them into cords. A woman might sit by the fire with her spindle spinning wool into rough strands, not for weaving, but for repair. These cords were bulky and uneven, yet they blended easily with woolen tunics and cloaks. Sometimes the repair itself vanished into the fabric, making the garment whole again in appearance, if not in truth. At other times the stitches stood out plainly, thick ridges that told the story of work done by necessity, rather than choice. The act of preparing these fibers was often communal. Families gathered to spin, twist, and braid, working together as the seasons demanded. Children helped by stripping nettles or carding wool, while elders guided the process with practiced hands. In winter, when the fields slept beneath snow, spinning became a nightly ritual. The cottage would be filled with the sound of fibers pulled and twisted, the soft hum of voices, and the steady crackle of the fire. Out of this labor threads were born, threads that would bind not only garments, but also the community itself. Yet thread alone was not always enough. Without fine needles, peasants often required thicker cords to tie or lace garments together. In these cases, plant fibers were braided into long strands, forming laces that could be threaded through holes in fabric. When peasants lacked needles, they turned to something far older, far more universal, the knot. Knots were as ancient as humanity itself, used to bind tools, secure shelters, and tie together the simplest necessities. In the absence of fine stitching, knotting became a language of survival, a quiet art form learned through practice, memory, and necessity. Where modern garments hide their seams in invisible lines, the clothing of peasants often bore the visible mark of knots, cords, and bindings, rough, uneven, but strong enough to endure the weight of daily labor. Imagine a peasant tunic, its sleeve torn open from shoulder to elbow after days of hauling wood. Without a needle, there is no way to stitch the fabric closed with invisible thread. Instead, the tear is pulled together with a cord made of hemp or flax, and the two edges are tied into a row of knots. They run down the sleeve like a ladder, each knot holding a little more of the garment's strength. To the eye it looks crude, but to the one who wears it, it is a lifeline. The sleeve may never look whole again, but it will serve its purpose in the biting cold of the fields. Knotting techniques varied from household to household, passed down like family recipes. Some tied simple square knots, sturdy and quick. Others wove loops and bindings, lacing torn cloth as one might lace a shoe. In certain regions, long tiers were repaired by braiding fibers directly into the fabric, creating a kind of woven scar across the garment. Each method reflected not just ingenuity, but the patience of hands that had no other choice. Repair was not art for its own sake, it was endurance written into every loop and twist. Bindings were also common. Strips of cloth cut from old garments were wrapped tightly around torn areas, holding them together in thick layers. A child's hose worn thin at the knee might be reinforced by winding a strip of wool around it and tying it in place. A shoe split along the sole could be bound with leather thongs until it held together once more. These bindings were not delicate, they were bold and obvious, the kind of repair that announced itself at a glance. But in a world where no scrap could be wasted, the sight of such repairs was not shameful, it was expected. It was honorable. Sometimes garments were held together not by thread at all, but by laces and loops. Cloaks especially were prone to tearing under the weight of wind and rain. To mend them, peasants often pierced small holes along the edges of the tier using a thorn, an awl, or even the sharpened tip of a bone. Through these holes they threaded a cord, lacing the cloak closed as one might lace a sack. The result looked almost like shoelaces drawn across fabric, each crisscross binding the garment tightly. When tightened, the cloak was whole again, if only in function. The ingenuity extended to shoes, which suffered greatly from hard labor. Leather cracked, seams burst, and soles wore thin. Without a needle, peasants used strips of rawhide or hemp cord to lash shoes back together. Holes were pierced into the leather, cords drawn through, knots tied along the seams. Shoes often looked like cages of cord and leather by the time they reached the end of their lives. Yet each binding brought a few more weeks of protection for the feet, a blessing when walking barefoot could mean frostbite, cuts, or infection. The act of knotting was not merely practical, it also carried rhythm and ritual. In the glow of the hearth, a mother might knot together the seams of her child's tunic while softly humming. The knots themselves seemed to echo her song, each one a note in a melody of care. Children watching learned the process as naturally as they learned to walk. They grew up not expecting garments to last without attention, but understanding that clothes, like people, needed tending when they were broken. Knots also held symbolic meaning. In many cultures, a tied knot represented a promise, a bond, or a prayer. Some peasants whispered blessings into their knots, believing that each twist of fiber might call down God's protection on the garment's wearer. A cloak tied together with knots was not only a shield against cold, but also a shield of faith, imbued with the hopes of the one who repaired it. In this way, the act of binding cloth became deeply human, both survival and devotion interwoven. The visible nature of knots meant that garments told stories without words. A tunic bound at the sleeve revealed a hard day in the fields. A cloak laced at the hem spoke of a winter storm that tore the fabric. Shoes lashed together with rawhide told of countless miles walked along stony roads. To those who looked closely, knots were more than repairs. They were records of endurance, diaries written in fiber and cord. Every villager knew what it meant to wear a patched garment. It meant you had lived, worked, and endured, and your clothing bore silent witness to that life. Not all repairs lasted long. knots loosened, cords frayed, bindings slipped. The work of mending was never finished, just as the work of farming was never finished. A garment repaired in the evening might tear again by week's end, but peasants accepted this as part of life. Just as fields had to be tilled again each spring, clothing had to be repaired again and again. The rhythm of knots and bindings was woven into the rhythm of existence itself. Yet within this endless cycle, there was resilience. A noble's garment might appear flawless, stitched invisibly by skilled hands, but when torn beyond repair, it was often cast aside. A peasant's garment, though rough with cords and scars, lived on. It was given second and third lives, held together by ingenuity until the very fabric thinned to nothing. There is a quiet triumph in this endurance, a reminder that beauty lies not in perfection, but in persistence. Think of the sight: a village gathering on a Sunday, families walking to church, cloaks patched with squares of cloth, sleeves bound with cords, shoes tied with strips of leather. To the wealthy eye, it may have seemed ragged, but to those who wore them, these garments were proof of survival. Each knot was a victory, each binding a declaration: we endure, despite the scarcity, despite the cold, despite the unending toil. Thus knotting and binding became more than practical skills. They became traditions, symbols and lessons passed down through generations. Children learned to tie knots not only for ropes and fishing lines, but for the very clothes on their backs. Husbands and wives shared the task of mending in quiet partnership. Elders, their hands slower but wiser, showed the younger ones how to make repairs last longer. In this communal sharing, knots became threads of continuity, linking past, present and future through the simplest of acts. In the end, the art of knotting and binding was never about elegance. It was about survival, written plainly into cloth: torn sleeves bound with hemp, shoes lashed together with rawhide, cloaks laced closed with cords of flax. These were the everyday miracles of peasant life, acts of quiet ingenuity that kept bodies clothed and families alive. Where needles were absent, knots stepped forward, carrying the weight of human resilience in their small, unassuming loops. If knots and bindings were the skeleton that held a peasant's garment together, then patches were the skin that gave it character. To the modern eye, a patch is often associated with poverty or neglect. But in the medieval world, patches were not merely signs of scarcity, they were evidence of resilience, of creativity, and of the stories people carried on their backs. Each patch was a declaration: this garment still has life, and so does the one who wears it. Picture a tunic worn for years, its wool thinned by countless days of work in the fields. When a hole opened at the elbow, the garment might have been useless in another household, but in the peasant's home, it was simply the beginning of another chapter. A square of cloth, cut from an old garment too worn to save, would be stitched, tied or even laced over the hole. The patch did not hide the tear, it embraced it, turning damage into design, necessity into endurance. These patches came in every shape and size. Some were rough rectangles, sewn hastily with thick thread. Others were carefully shaped to match the tear, fitted like puzzle pieces into the fabric. A cloak might have dozens of such patches scattered across it, creating a mosaic of textures and colors. From a distance the garment looked uneven, perhaps even ragged, but up close it was a masterpiece of survival. A patchwork quilt carried not on a bed, but on a body. Children often wore the most heavily patched garments. As they grew, their tunics and hose quickly became too small, so cloth was added to lengthen sleeves, widen hems or reinforce knees worn thin from play. To parents, these patches were not marks of shame, but symbols of care. Each one represented an hour at the hearth, a night spent by firelight, ensuring that their child would remain clothed and warm. To see a child running across the village green, knees covered with colorful patches, was to see love made visible in wool and flax. Patches also carried stories of time and place. A scrap of fabric cut from an uncle's cloak might be sewn into a child's tunic. A square of worn linen from a grandmother's apron might find new life in a daughter's skirt. Clothing became archives of memory, carrying traces of relatives, neighbors and even the dead. In this way, garments were not only mended, they were enriched. A patch was more than a repair, it was a link in a chain of human continuity. The practice of patching also revealed cultural attitudes toward poverty and pride. Among nobles, clothing was a statement of wealth. and patches were hidden or avoided. Among peasants, however, patches were inevitable. No garment survived without them, and so rather than conceal them, peasants wore them openly. In villages, patched garments were a shared language understood by all. A man with patches across his knees was known to labor in the fields. A woman with patched sleeves had carried heavy baskets or tended animals. Each patch told of effort, endurance, and dignity. There were moments when patches even became sources of beauty. Some peasants, when time allowed, chose patches of contrasting color: red wool against brown, blue linen against gray. A cloak with brightly mismatched patches stood out like a painted canvas. Travelers passing through villages sometimes remarked on these colorful garments, surprised that even in poverty there was a spark of artistry. It was not luxury, but it was expression, the human urge to make something more than useful, to make it meaningful. In some traditions, patches were also a form of silent communication. To gift a scrap of fabric to another family was to share resources, a gesture of solidarity. A patch from one household sewn into the clothing of another became a quiet bond, a reminder that survival was never solitary. Villages depended on one another, and patched garments carried those invisible ties across fields and into marketplaces. Think of a winter gathering at the village church. Families arrive wrapped in cloaks, each one layered with patches. The flickering light of candles reveals seams of contrasting cloth, red squares stitched onto brown wool, pale linen set against darker hues. To the outsider, it might look like a sea of poverty, but within the community, every patch was recognized, every square understood as a story. That cloak carried a fragment of a mother's apron, that tunic bore a scrap from a brother's cast-off. Each garment was less a symbol of lack, and more a reminder of shared endurance. Over time, certain garments became living patchworks. A man might keep the same cloak for 20 years, its original fabric nearly hidden beneath layer after layer of repairs. To replace it entirely would have been costly, but to maintain it through patches was an act of devotion. Such garments were cherished, for they carried not just warmth, but decades of memory. To wear them was to carry one's own history stitched across the shoulders. Children sometimes asked about the stories behind patches. Where did this square come from? A child might ask, pointing to the elbow of a tunic. A mother would smile and explain, it came from an old garment worn by a grandfather long gone, or by a cousin who had since moved away. In this way, clothing became storytelling, and each patch opened a doorway to memory. At bedtime, as children drifted to sleep, their garments hung by the hearth were not just clothes. They were books written in fabric, volumes stitched with love, endurance, and history. There is something profoundly human in this way of mending. A noble's garment, discarded at the first tier, vanished into history. But a peasant's patched tunic lived on, a witness to struggle and persistence. Even when the original cloth gave way entirely, the patches themselves could be salvaged, cut away to repair yet another garment. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was forgotten. To us, centuries later, patched garments may seem crude or unsightly, but to those who wore them, they were emblems of survival. They carried pride, not shame. They were proof that life continued, even in hardship. A patch was not the end of a garment's story, it was the next chapter. And so, in the quiet labor of patching, peasants wrote stories in cloth, stories of endurance, of community, and of the timeless human will to make broken things whole again. The rhythm of medieval life was set not by clocks, but by the seasons. Time was marked by the length of daylight, the tilt of the sun, the turning of leaves, and the bitter bite of the wind. For peasants, these cycles dictated when fields were plowed, when animals were tended, and when garments had to be readied for the trials to come. Repairing clothes was never random, it was planned with the seasons, woven into the very calendar of survival. As spring stretched into summer, peasants began to think ahead. The long days of warmth made repairs less urgent. Garments were lighter, tunics and shifts worn thin, but manageable in the heat. But all knew that autumn loomed, and with it the harvest, the most demanding weeks of the year. The harvest was not simply work, it was an ordeal, a communal struggle requiring every body, every hand, every ounce of strength. To step into the fields with garments already torn or fraying was to invite disaster. A sleeve ripped wide in the middle of reaping could not be fixed, when every moment was needed to cut the grain. And so, as the days grew long, women and men alike prepared their clothes for the season ahead. Families gathered scraps of cloth, lengths of cord, and sturdy wool thread if they could find it. Tunics were examined in the glow of summer evenings. Knees were reinforced, knowing they would soon press against soil. Elbows were bound, certain to bend and strain beneath the weight of sheaves. Even footwear, clumsy, patched leather shoes or wooden clogs, was strengthened with extra bindings. The work was not glamorous, but it was essential. A torn tunic could be tolerated in June, but not in September, when every day of the harvest determined whether a family would eat or starve through winter. For women, the harvest season required its own kind of preparation. Aprons, shifts, and head coverings had to endure weeks of bending, lifting, and long hours in the sun. Linen garments, already worn thin by repeated washing, were carefully patched in advance. Extra cords were tucked away in baskets, ready to be used if a sudden tear demanded attention. In some villages, mothers gathered together before harvest, pooling scraps and exchanging patches so that every household could face the fields with garments made as strong as possible. This was not vanity, it was survival strategy. Then came the harvest itself, a thunderous rush of human labor stretched across days and weeks. Men cut grain with sickles, their patched sleeves brushing against stalks of barley and wheat. Women followed behind, gathering and binding sheaves, their aprons catching dust and sweat. Children too worked in the fields, carrying water, picking up stray stalks, or scaring away birds. Through it all, garments bore the strain. The seams creaked, the knees wore thin, the shoulders grew dark with sweat. But because of the careful repairs done in summer evenings, clothing endured. It stretched and strained, but it did not fail. The end of harvest was not the end of repairs. It was only the beginning of the next, greater challenge: winter. If harvest tested garments with labor, winter tested them with endurance. Cold seeped through every gap, every tear, every threadbare place. To enter winter unprepared was to invite frostbite, illness, or death. And so, as the last sheaves were stored, and the final grain threshed, peasants turned once again to their garments, not just to patch them, but to fortify them against the cold. Winter repairs were heavier, thicker, and more urgent. Cloaks were layered with additional cloth, sometimes old sacks or blankets, cut into strips, and bound within the lining. Tunics were lengthened with woolen hems, providing extra protection for legs. Gloves, often little more than scraps tied around fingers, were reinforced with layers of linen and stitched wool. In the poorest households, where cloth was scarce, straw was sometimes stuffed between layers of fabric, to serve as insulation. It rustled and shifted, but it gave warmth, and warmth was everything. The approach of winter also revealed the ingenuity of peasants. Without access to fine tools, they relied on what they had. Animal sinew was sometimes used in place of thread, strong and durable even in the cold. Strips of leather were bound around shoes to keep snow and ice at bay. Women twisted flax into cords and threaded them through garments to hold makeshift patches. Each innovation was born not of luxury, but of necessity, the quiet genius of survival repeated across centuries. The cycle of preparation gave rise to rituals. In some villages, autumn evenings became communal repair nights. Families gathered by firelight, not only to mend garments, but to share news, tell stories, and pass on skills. A grandmother might demonstrate the proper way to fold a patch so that it resisted fraying. A father might show how to twist wool into cord. Children, watching closely, learned that survival was not only in the fields, but also at the hearth, in the steady rhythm of needleless stitching and knotting. These gatherings were more than practical, they were cultural, binding the community together as tightly as the threads bound their clothing. The sense of urgency deepened as the first frosts appeared. Peasants checked and rechecked their cloaks, making sure no hole remained. They pulled garments over one another, 2 tunics, 3 if possible, each one patched, bound, and mended to the limit of endurance. A winter cloak might weigh heavy with layers of cloth, but it was better to be burdened than frozen. Even children's garments were doubled and tripled, every scrap of fabric pressed into service. To the eye of a noble, it might have looked clumsy, even comical. To the peasant it was armor, protection against the long, merciless nights. In winter, clothing was rarely washed. The risk of freezing water and the scarcity of warmth made laundering dangerous. Instead, garments grew stiff with use, their patches darkened by soot and smoke from the hearth. Yet they endured, because they had been prepared for this season. The care taken in autumn, the careful stitching, the clever layering, the countless hours of preparation, made survival possible. There is something deeply symbolic in this cycle of seasonal repair. Clothing was not just fabric, it was time itself, marked and measured by labor. Spring garments were lighter, mended for movement. Summer garments were reinforced for harvest. Winter garments were fortified like shields. Each season left its mark, and each repair carried forward into the next year. To look at a peasant's cloak was to see the calendar stitched into its seams, and beneath it all, there was hope. Every repair done before harvest carried the hope of a full barn. Every repair before winter carried the hope of survival until spring. Patching, binding, layering. These acts were not just practical tasks. They were expressions of belief in the future, however uncertain. A patched tunic said, "I will endure the harvest." A layered cloak said, "I will see another spring." In this way, peasants carried their faith, not in words, but in the quiet stitches and bindings of their clothes. To us, centuries later, it may seem a small thing, this endless mending with scraps and cords, but for peasants it was the very rhythm of life. Without these seasonal repairs, they could not work, could not endure, could not live. With them they faced the cycles of nature not as helpless victims, but as participants in a grand unending struggle, a struggle written in every patched knee, every bound seam, every heavy cloak hung by the hearth. The turning of seasons already placed endless strain on peasants, but famine and crisis brought a sharper, darker trial. In years when harvests failed or war passed through the land, cloth became more precious than bread. Food could sometimes be begged or foraged, but clothing, once lost, was nearly impossible to replace. In those lean years, garments were guarded, repurposed, and reforged as if they were living companions, carrying peasants through storms of hunger and uncertainty. Famine was never far away in the medieval world. A wet summer could rot the grain, a dry one could burn the fields to dust. A swarm of locusts or a sudden frost could undo an entire season of labor in a single week. When that happened, households did not simply lose their harvest. They lost the chance to barter for cloth at market, the chance to buy thread, the chance to replace the garments already stretched to their limit. Clothing froze in time. Whatever one owned on the eve of famine had to endure, no matter how frayed or thin. In these moments, repairs became desperate. Patching was no longer neat or hidden. It was bold, visible, and layered upon itself until garments looked like patchwork maps of survival. A tunic might carry 20 patches, some overlapping like scales, others stitched with whatever cord or sinew could be found. Old sacks, torn bedsheets, even strips of curtains salvaged from abandoned houses were sewn into garments. Nobles might sneer at the sight, but to peasants, these were not rags. They were lifelines, shields against both cold and shame. Families in famine found themselves competing with time. Cloth wore thin faster because bodies grew thinner. Bones pressed through fabric at knees and elbows, grinding against seams that once had more give. The malnourished body strained its clothing in ways that surprised even those used to hardship. And so, the cycle of repair grew frantic. Night after night, by candle stubs or hearth embers, mothers and grandmothers worked with trembling hands, tying knots and layering scraps, making a sleeve last just a little longer, a cloak endure one more frost. When crisis deepened, ingenuity sharpened. Some peasants began to weave together strands of straw, creating makeshift cloth to reinforce garments. It was brittle, but when bound between layers of linen, it added insulation. Others used nettle fibers, stripped and softened, to create cord for binding. Even animal hide, thin slices from goats or pigs, was cut and attached to elbows, knees and shoes. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap became part of the struggle, proof that survival demanded creativity as much as endurance. Shoes told the story most starkly. In times of famine, peasants could not afford new leather. Many walked barefoot, their feet toughened by years of labor. But in winter or on rough ground, some protection was needed. Old leather scraps were patched together, bound with cords or tied beneath the feet like makeshift sandals. Others layered cloth and stuffed it with moss or straw, creating clumsy but warmer coverings. These makeshift shoes wore out quickly, but each repair, each rebinding, was a declaration. I will walk another day. Famine also tested the bonds of community. In some villages, neighbors shared scraps and cloth just as they shared bread. A family with one extra cloak might tear it in two, giving part to another household. Others, driven by desperation, hoarded every scrap, unwilling to share even as their neighbors froze. Stories tell of families who boiled leather to eat, but before doing so, cut away the strongest parts to patch their shoes. Hunger gnawed at the belly, but the cold gnawed at the skin, and neither could be ignored. Crisis was not only born of famine, war too ravaged clothing. Armies marching through villages, stripped them bare, taking livestock, food and even cloth. A cloak could be torn from a peasant's shoulders by soldiers needing warmth. In the aftermath, peasants scavenged the fields not only for dropped weapons, but for scraps of cloth left behind. Torn banners, abandoned uniforms, even shreds of tents became clothing in disguise. Some peasants wore garments stitched from a dozen sources: a noble's sleeve, a soldier's cloak, a farmer's old tunic, all joined together in uneven harmony. During plague years, clothing carried another layer of meaning. It became both shield and suspect. People feared garments could carry illness, yet peasants had no choice but to wear what they had. Clothes were patched endlessly, even when they carried stains that could never be washed away. Repairing them was an act of both necessity and defiance, a way of saying that life would continue even as death lingered in every house. Amid famine and plague, garments became storytellers. To look at a peasant's cloak was to read a record of suffering and resilience. A patch of rough wool might speak of a neighbor's generosity. A strip of dyed fabric might show where a noble's house had been looted or abandoned. A layer of sackcloth might whisper of hunger so deep that grain sacks themselves had to be sacrificed to the cold. Each repair was a chapter in a silent book, read only by those who knew how to see. Children in famine wore the most pitiful clothes of all. Parents tore their own garments to wrap the young, layering scraps over fragile bodies. Little tunics were made from old sleeves, patched with whatever could be found. Mothers added layer after layer, even when children cried at the stiffness, knowing warmth mattered more than comfort. Many garments passed down were not heirlooms in the noble sense, but survival relics. Tiny patched cloaks that had once kept an elder brother alive, now worn by a younger sister. Famine also blurred the line between clothing and shelter. In years when families could not heat their cottages, cloaks became blankets, and patched garments doubled as bedding. A tunic patched 20 times might be shared between two siblings at night, one lying beneath it, the other curling against its side. The distinction between garment and household faded. Clothing was no longer just what one wore, but what one lived in. In the midst of this suffering, hope remained fragile but real. Every knot tied into a patch was a gesture toward tomorrow. Every cord twisted around a shoe said, "I will endure." Families taught their children not just how to work the land, but how to bind scraps into sleeves, how to lay a cloth for warmth, how to transform scarcity into survival. In famine, these skills were more valuable than tools. They were the difference between despair and endurance. From a distance of centuries, we might see only the raggedness, the patched and layered garments of peasants in crisis. But look closer, and you see something else: resilience, ingenuity, and the will to survive. In every stitch there is defiance. In every patch there is persistence. In famine and in war, peasants could not choose abundance, but they could choose to repair, to endure, and to hope. Their garments were not just clothing, they were shields of faith, stitched from scraps yet stronger than despair itself. In the dim light of a medieval cottage, the work of mending was not always about bold patches or obvious reinforcements. Sometimes the art of survival lay in subtlety, in the ability to make a tear vanish, a hole disappear, or a fray become seamless. These were the invisible repairs, the quiet triumphs of patience and skill, where a garment did not simply endure, but seemed reborn. For peasants, such work carried pride, dignity, and sometimes even the illusion of newness, a gift as precious as the fabric itself. The idea of an invisible repair was not about vanity in the modern sense. Peasants were not striving for elegance to impress a courtly audience. Rather, invisibility meant preserving the integrity of a garment, keeping it whole and useful, without announcing its weakness. A hidden mend meant fewer questions at market, fewer sneers from wealthier eyes, fewer reminders of poverty. A cloak that bore no obvious scars could pass as strong and trustworthy, shielding its wearer not only from weather, but from judgment. The most skilled hands in the village were often those of older women who had spent decades practicing this craft. They knew how to match thread to fabric by teasing fibers from the cloth itself, spinning them thin, and reintroducing them back into the weave. When no proper thread could be found, they unraveled the inside hem of a garment, stealing a strand where it would never be missed. With this they could work their needle, or in its absence a bone pin or fish spine, so delicately that a hole disappeared into the surrounding fabric, invisible to the untrained eye. This process was painstaking. A small tear in linen might require hours of work, each fiber drawn through carefully, each knot tied with near-invisible precision. Weaving and reweaving, the mender created not a patch but a continuation of the cloth's story, as though time itself had been rewound. It was as much meditation as labor. In the silence of evening, one could hear the faint tug of thread, the soft exhale of breath, the whispered rhythm of survival woven back into place. Invisible repairs also carried an emotional weight. For many they represented care and love, work done not for oneself but for a child, a spouse, or a parent. A mother might spend an entire night repairing her son's tunic, so that he would look presentable for market day. A daughter might mend her father's cloak without his noticing, sparing him the shame of walking with elbows exposed. These invisible acts of labor, unseen and often unspoken, were gestures of devotion as enduring as the garments they restored. Not every material invited invisibility. Coarse wool, patched too many times, became a canvas of scars, but finer linens, if treated with patience, could be coaxed back into shape. This gave rise to techniques that blurred the line between sewing and weaving. In some regions, peasants practiced darning, a method of rethreading over a hole, weaving new fibers across the gap, until it blended seamlessly with the original fabric. The skill required was immense, but the result could astonish a sock or sleeve that seemed whole again, even under close inspection. Invisible repairs also reflected a subtle hierarchy within peasant communities. A well-mended garment spoke of a household that cared, that invested time and effort in preservation. Those with less patience or skill wore clothes marked by crude patches, loud signals of hardship. But those who practiced invisibility could walk through the village with garments that looked deceptively sound, a quiet dignity that softened the sharp edges of poverty. Yet invisibility was not merely about hiding weakness, it was also about memory. A hidden repair carried within it the story of a tear, an accident in the field, a snag against a wooden cart, a stumble on a stone road. To outsiders, the garment looked whole, but the wearer knew the truth. Beneath the smooth fabric lay the site of a struggle, carefully mended and now invisible. It was a metaphor perhaps for peasant life itself: wounds, hidden pain, endured survival carried quietly. The tools used for such repairs were often humble but handled with reverence. A bone needle, passed down through generations, might have been used to mend hundreds of garments. A single spool of thread could last for years if guarded carefully, each fiber unwound and respun as needed. Even sharp thorns, when dried and polished, could serve as temporary tools for delicate work. The invisibility of the repair was not born from wealth, but from resourcefulness. Sometimes, these invisible repairs crossed the line into artistry. A particularly skilled hand could reweave so perfectly that the fabric appeared untouched, stronger even than before. Such work was admired, whispered about among neighbors, and occasionally sought out by wealthier households who wished their garments restored without blemish. In these rare moments, the peasant craft of invisible repair reached upward, brushing against the world of nobility, though it remained rooted in survival rather than luxury. Children often learned the art, not by instruction, but by observation. Sitting by the hearth, they watched as elders worked the fibers, whispering prayers under their breath, their faces lit by firelight. Slowly children imitated the motions, first clumsy, then steadier, until one day their own stitches blended seamlessly. This passing down of skill ensured that invisibility endured as a tradition, one not written in books but etched into muscle memory, carried from one generation's hands to the next. Invisible repairs also reveal something profound about the medieval mindset. In a world where life was fragile, and survival uncertain, there was comfort in restoring what seemed broken. To mend invisibly was to resist despair, to insist that wholeness was still possible. It was a philosophy as much as a skill, that brokenness need not be final, that with patience, even the most fragile things could be made strong again. From our modern perspective, we might marvel at the patience required. Today, clothing is often discarded at the first sign of wear, replaced without thought. But to the medieval peasant, every fiber was worth saving, every thread a resource too precious to waste. To make a repair vanish was to honor the fabric, to stretch its life far beyond what seemed possible. In this quiet art, peasants demonstrated not only thrift, but reverence, for cloth, for labor, for endurance itself. And so when we imagine the medieval world, let us not see only ragged garments and crude patches. Let us also picture the tunics that looked whole, the cloaks that seemed unbroken, the invisible seams that carried stories unseen. For behind those garments lay hours of hidden labor, an art practiced in silence by hands that turned survival into craft, and craft into dignity. Invisible repairs may not have been celebrated in songs or chronicled in noble manuscripts, but they endured in the lives of those who wore them. They were the unseen foundation of peasant resilience, proof that even in poverty, there was space for pride, patience and beauty. And though centuries have passed, the lesson remains timeless. Sometimes, the most powerful repairs are the ones no one else can see. In the medieval world, clothing was far more than a practical covering against the elements. For peasants, it was one of the few possessions that could truly endure across generations, carrying with it the memories, struggles and resilience of a family line. While nobles passed down jewelry, lands and manuscripts, peasants often had only garments to offer. Yet these humble garments were imbued with value, practical, emotional, and symbolic, that transformed them into treasures. When a child slipped into a tunic once worn by a parent, it was not merely an act of convenience, it was an inheritance. The fabric bore the marks of the parent's life, the faint fray at the cuffs from years of harvesting, the softened knees from kneeling in prayer or tending to fields, the sun-faded shoulders from hours beneath an open sky. To wear such clothing was to step into a story already begun, to carry forward a continuity that gave strength and identity. For families who could not afford new materials, inheritance was a necessity. Babies wore swaddling cloths that had wrapped their older siblings, sometimes their parents, before them. Wedding garments, often simple but cherished, were carefully preserved so that a daughter might wear her mother's dress, altered with invisible stitches to fit a new figure. In these ways, fabric became a thread that bound one generation to the next, each stitch holding memory as tightly as it held the cloth. These inherited garments were often layered with repairs. A cloak might show the work of many different hands over decades, a grandmother's neat invisible mend at the elbow, a father's crude patch along the hem, a mother's careful darning near the collar. Each repair became part of the garment's lineage, a record not only of wear but of care. To a modern eye, such clothing might appear ragged, but to its owner, it was a living testament, more valuable for its history than for its outward appearance. Clothing as treasure also had a protective quality. Families guarded their garments carefully, storing them in chests, wrapping them in cloth, hanging them high to keep them from mice. On journeys, the best clothing might be hidden away, carried only when safety was assured. Losing a garment to theft or fire was not a trivial matter. It was like losing a piece of the family itself. The sorrow could be profound, for clothing carried not only material worth but emotional weight. There were also symbolic garments, set aside for special moments and treasured even more. A woolen hood worn by a grandfather at his first harvest might be passed down to a grandson who now worked the same fields. A linen shirt worn at a wedding could reappear years later when the child of that union celebrated their own vows. These garments, often fragile with age, were treated with reverence, as though they held within them the blessings of past lives. Children grew up with the knowledge that what they wore was not entirely their own. A girl might hear her mother say, "This was your aunt's dress before it was mine, and now it is yours." Such words tied her identity to her family's survival, teaching her that clothing was not disposable but enduring, not individual but communal. In this way, fabric became part of the moral education of children, a lesson in gratitude, humility and the sacredness of what little they had. Sometimes inherited clothing even acted as a bridge to those who had passed away. A son might wear his father's cloak long after his death, finding comfort in the familiar smell of wool, the memory of warmth once shared. A daughter might wear her mother's apron, feeling her presence with every tied knot. In a world where death was frequent and sudden, clothing became a tangible way of holding on to memory, a relic of love that could be worn against the skin. It was not uncommon for garments to last decades, even lifetimes, so long as they were constantly repaired. A pair of shoes might pass from father to son, resoled and stitched so many times that little of the original leather remained. Yet it was still called the father's shoes, still treasured because they had carried his steps. Similarly, a cloak might become thinner with every winter, but as long as it existed in some form, it remained a family treasure. This inheritance also reinforced a sense of continuity in the community. When a child walked through the village in a tunic once worn by their father, neighbors noticed, they recognized the garment, remembered its former wearer, and sometimes commented aloud, "That was your mother's cloak, wasn't it? I remember when she wore it to market." In this way, clothing connected not only families but entire communities, reminding everyone of their shared past and their interwoven fates. At times, garments became heirlooms in the truest sense, guarded with a care that went beyond necessity. A particularly fine woolen cloak, rare in its quality, might be preserved for generations, each wearer adding their mark, yet striving to maintain its dignity. Such pieces were spoken of with pride, mentioned in family stories, cherished as much as any noble's jeweled ring. For peasants, clothing could indeed be treasure, not because of its cost, but because of its endurance and meaning. The act of handing down clothing was often ceremonial. A mother might prepare a dress for her daughter's first feast day, telling her the story of when she herself wore it, how she danced in it, how it carried the warmth of old memories. A father might place his cloak on his son's shoulders the day he first joined the men in the fields, a silent but powerful gesture of inheritance. These moments transformed ordinary garments into sacred vessels of belonging. Of course, not every garment survived intact. Some were cut down, reshaped, or repurposed as they aged. A tunic might become a child's shirt, then a work rag, then finally stuffing for bedding. Even in these transformations, the garment's life was extended, its usefulness stretched across years, perhaps decades. The idea of waste was nearly unthinkable. To throw away a garment was to discard history itself. In the end, when garments could no longer serve in any form, they were remembered. Stories lingered of the cloak that lasted 30 winters, or the boots that walked 3 generations of men to market. Such stories were told with pride, even humor, but always with respect. For in a world where possessions were scarce, clothing stood as proof of endurance, of love preserved through careful hands, of a family's will to carry on. When we look back now, it is easy to see only poverty in these traditions. But to the medieval peasant, inherited clothing was richness of another kind. It was treasure not counted in coins but in memories, not stored in vaults, but in wooden chests, not displayed in grandeur but worn against the skin. It was living treasure, faded, patched, softened by years of labor, yet shining with the quiet wealth of belonging. Clothing in the medieval world was not only fabric stitched together for warmth or modesty. For peasants, every thread, every patch and every shade of dye carried meaning, whether intended or unconsciously absorbed by the culture around them. Symbolism wove itself into the garments they wore, creating silent languages of identity, morality, faith, and belonging. To wear clothing in the Middle Ages was to take part in a story larger than oneself, one told through colors, materials, shapes, and even repairs. The most immediate symbolism came from color. Natural dyes were expensive and difficult to produce, which meant that hues carried a clear message about who one was. For peasants, deep blues, vibrant reds, and rich purples were nearly impossible to afford. Instead, their garments tended toward earthy shades, brown from oak bark, pale yellows from onion skins, muted greens from nettles, or undyed beige wool. These colors, though simple, spoke volumes. They were the colors of the earth itself, binding peasants symbolically to the soil they worked, to the seasons that ruled their lives, and to the humility that defined their social station. Yet even within these natural tones, meaning could be found. A garment tinged with green might hint at fertility and life, a quiet nod to the fields and forests that fed the village. Yellow, though often associated with poverty or frailty, could also carry echoes of sunlight and warmth. Brown might symbolize humility, a life lived close to the land. These interpretations were rarely spoken aloud, but they lived in the cultural imagination, shaping how people saw themselves and others. Religious symbolism also infused clothing. For peasants, Christianity was not a distant theology, but a daily presence, shaping every ritual and habit. Clothing, too, became a vessel for faith. Cross-shaped stitches sometimes appeared in mending, not only because they were practical, but because they offered protection, a small invocation of blessing over a garment that might shield the body through many winters. Wearing one's Sunday best to Mass was not only an attempt at respectability, it was a symbolic act of devotion, offering God the best of what little one had. Even the division between clean and worn garments carried symbolic meaning. A clean tunic, however simple, reflected inner order, discipline, and virtue. A ragged, unwashed garment could be seen as shameful, even sinful, though poverty often left no other choice. In this way, clothing symbolized morality itself, as though the state of fabric mirrored the state of the soul. There was also symbolism in the very act of repair. To mend a cloak with patience and care symbolized love, not only for the garment, but for the person who would wear it. A mother sewing her child's shirt was not just preserving fabric, she was preserving the child's well-being, the family's dignity, and even the household's future. Each patch, each reinforcement, symbolized perseverance in the face of hardship. Inherited garments bore layers of this symbolism. Every mend spoke of endurance, every stitch of devotion. Clothing also symbolized life stages. A swaddling cloth marked the beginning of life, while a shroud marked its end. The garments worn on feast days symbolized joy and thanksgiving, while work clothes symbolized duty and survival. Weddings carried their own symbolism. Even if a bride wore a simple woolen dress, it became a symbol of union, sanctity, and hope for new life. These garments were more than functional. They carried the sacred moments of human existence upon their threads. In some cases, peasants found ways to mimic or reinterpret the symbolism of noble clothing. A poor man could never wear crimson velvet like a lord, but he might dye his wool with madder root to create a faint red hue, symbolizing vitality and strength in his own humble way. A woman might embroider a small pattern onto her apron, not with silk thread, but with colored wool, creating her own symbolic display of care, patience, and beauty. These acts were not rebellion, but quiet participation in a broader cultural language, reshaped through the lens of poverty. Symbolism also appeared in seasonal garments. Cloaks worn at harvest time might symbolize protection and provision, their very presence a reminder of the labor that would sustain the family through winter. Winter garments, layered and patched, symbolized endurance against cold and hardship. Springtime garments, though still humble, might carry small touches of brightness, perhaps a cleaner linen shirt, a sprig of herbs pinned for fragrance, that symbolized renewal and hope. Communal symbolism was equally powerful. When peasants gathered for festivals, their collective clothing told a story of shared identity. Though individual garments were simple, the sight of an entire community dressed in their best garments symbolized unity and strength. On holy days, this unity took on sacred significance. The congregation gathered not as scattered individuals, but as one body bound together in faith, and clothing became a symbol of this shared devotion. There were also darker symbols attached to garments. A ripped sleeve might symbolize dishonor or misfortune. Clothing stained with blood could be a mark of shame or tragedy. Garments too tattered to repair could symbolize decline, a visual sign of a family's struggle slipping beyond endurance. In some villages, gossip spread quickly about the state of clothing. A family that could not keep their garments intact might be judged as careless, even cursed. Thus, clothing symbolized not only dignity, but reputation. And yet, even in rags, symbolism could turn toward resilience. A man who walked to church in a patched cloak might be pitied by some, but admired by others for his perseverance. His garment symbolized survival, the triumph of determination over despair. The same cloak, viewed from another angle, could symbolize humility and closeness to Christ, who himself was often imagined in simple robes, close to the poor and the broken. Children learned these symbols early. A girl understood that her patched dress was more than fabric. It was a sign of her family's labor, her mother's devotion, her own place in the unfolding story of survival. A boy knew that when he received his father's old tunic, it symbolized not only necessity, but inheritance, the passing down of responsibility. These quiet lessons taught children that clothing was never meaningless. It always carried weight, always spoke in silent language. Even beyond the grave, clothing carried symbolism. Burial garments, though simple, were chosen with care. They symbolized purity, humility, and readiness for eternity. To be buried in a clean linen shroud, however plain, was considered an act of dignity. Families took pride in preparing such garments, knowing they symbolized not wealth, but hope, the belief that the soul, clothed in simple fabric, might enter into glory, clothed in light. In the end, symbolism in clothing for peasants was inseparable from life itself. Every thread spoke of belonging, to family, to faith, to community, to the earth. Every patch told a story of love and survival. Every color, however faded, reflected the rhythms of nature and the hierarchies of society. To wear a garment was to carry meaning, to step into a language older than words, a tapestry woven of faith, struggle, and endurance. And so, though the garments of peasants were humble, their symbolism was vast. A patched cloak was not just a cloak, a faded tunic was not just a tunic. They were symbols of devotion, of hardship borne with dignity, of lives lived close to the earth, and yet reaching toward eternity. The peasant's clothing may not have glittered with jewels or shimmered with silks, but it carried meanings far richer, meanings that endured across generations, stitched deep into the very fabric of survival. The life of a medieval peasant was defined not only by toil, but by the rhythm of the seasons. Clothing, like food and shelter, became a crucial part of survival, adapting itself to the relentless cycles of heat and cold, abundance and hunger, plenty and scarcity. Each season demanded something different from the garments that peasants wore, and every piece of clothing bore the marks of improvisation, repair, and resilience. To live through a medieval year was to experience how fabric could mean the difference between life and death. Spring carried with it the promise of renewal. After the long, grueling winter, when garments had been worn thin and mended countless times, spring offered fresh air and warmer days. Yet peasants did not own wardrobes in the modern sense. They had only a few garments to their name, which meant that the same tunic or dress might serve across multiple seasons. In spring, garments were aired out, scrubbed in the rivers, beaten against stones to remove the dirt of winter. Repairs were made, and patches were reinforced. Symbolically, this spring cleaning was more than practical. It was a ritual of survival, ensuring that the thin barrier of cloth between body and world could last another year. Summer brought different challenges. The sun bore down on fields where peasants worked from dawn until dusk, their backs bent under labor. Heavy wool cloaks, necessary in winter, became unbearable in the heat. Peasants turned to lighter garments, often linen shirts or simple tunics, garments that could breathe in the hot air. Linen, though prized, was still a precious commodity, and most peasants owned only one or two such shirts. Sweat soaked the fabric, and by evening the garments were stiff with salt. Yet these summer clothes, though humble, were crucial. They prevented sunburn, shielded the skin from scratches and insect bites, and symbolized the endurance of labor. Scarcity in summer took a different form. Though the fields were green, food was still not yet abundant until harvest. Clothing too was stretched thin. Shoes wore out quickly in the fields, their leather cracked by heat and dry earth. Peasants often went barefoot, their feet hardened against the ground. Children ran barefoot almost always, their garments shortened to allow for growth. It was not merely poverty, but adaptation. Each piece of fabric saved meant survival when colder seasons returned. Autumn was the season of transition, and with it came new demands on clothing. Harvest meant long days in the fields, bending and lifting, threshing and storing. Clothing grew heavy with dust and straw, and garments were often reinforced before harvest to endure the strain. An extra patch sewn at the knee, a double stitch at the shoulder seam, these small preparations made the difference between a tunic that lasted through harvest and one that tore under strain. Autumn also meant cooler nights, and peasants layered garments, wearing cloaks once again as frost crept in. Symbolically, autumn clothing represented readiness, the gathering in of resources, the preservation of warmth, the anticipation of winter's severity. But it was winter that tested clothing most brutally. The cold was not a mild discomfort, it was a force that could kill. Homes were drafty, fires small and fuel scarce. In these months clothing became armor against death. Wool cloaks, patched and repatched, were layered over tunics. Children were wrapped in whatever scraps could be spared. Gloves were rare. Instead, peasants wrapped their hands in cloth or old wool. Feet too suffered. Shoes were stuffed with straw for insulation, or else rags were bound tightly around ankles and toes. Every decision about clothing in winter was a decision about survival. Scarcity in winter was merciless. A family without enough clothing might share garments, passing cloaks from one to another, or huddling together for warmth. Blankets were few, so cloaks doubled as bedding. The garments of the dead were stripped, washed and reused by the living, their fabric carrying the weight of memory, but also the gift of survival. To patch a cloak in winter was not merely an act of thrift, it was an act of hope, a defiance of the cold that sought to claim the body. The rhythm of scarcity also revealed itself in the cycle of mending. Each season brought new tears, new frays, new damage. A winter cloak might be patched with lighter fabric in spring, not because it was ideal, but because it was available. A summer tunic might be lengthened with darker wool for winter wear. Scarcity forced creativity, turning every scrap of fabric into possibility. Old sacks became aprons, worn-out hoods became children's garments, and ragged hems were trimmed and re-stitched to prolong life. These adaptations carried emotional weight. Clothing tied families together across the seasons. A child might wear a tunic that had once belonged to an older sibling, or even a parent. Each season added new layers of mending until garments became living records of survival. Peasants did not speak of wardrobes, in terms of fashion, but in terms of endurance. Which cloak had lasted 5 winters, which shoes had been patched thrice. The pride of survival was woven into every seam. Festivals and holy days created moments of contrast in the rhythm of scarcity. On Christmas or Easter, peasants wore their best garments, however simple, as symbols of joy and reverence. Even if a tunic was faded, it was carefully washed and mended for such occasions. These garments were often put away after the feast, saved for the next year, while daily garments bore the brunt of labor. In this way, clothing reflected not only survival, but hope. The ability to carve out moments of dignity, in a life defined by struggle. Scarcity also bred communal practices. Villages often shared resources, and clothing was no exception. A neighbor might lend a cloak to someone in dire need, or a family might pass down outgrown garments to kin. Weddings and births were occasions where clothing exchanged hands, each piece carrying stories of its former owner. In times of famine or plague, clothing sometimes symbolized generosity itself, the willingness to give from one's own scarcity, to preserve another's life. The passing of seasons also revealed the relationship between peasants and the natural world. Clothing was drawn from the land itself, wool from sheep, linen from flax, dyes from plants. The scarcity of fabric was tied directly to the health of harvests and the strength of livestock. A harsh winter that killed sheep meant less wool, fewer garments, and greater suffering. In this sense, clothing was a mirror of nature's cycles, a visible sign of the precarious balance between human survival and the earth's provision. Over time, peasants developed rituals and wisdom about clothing that helped them survive scarcity. Children were taught how to mend simple tears, how to wash garments without destroying fabric, how to store clothing away from damp and vermin. These practices were not luxuries, but lifelines. To waste fabric was to risk survival, and so the careful tending of garments became a moral duty as much as a practical skill. In the end, the survival of peasants through seasons and scarcity was not a story of fashion, but of endurance. Clothing became the shield against nature's extremes, the record of labor and sacrifice, the silent companion through cycles of want and hope. Each patched tunic, each mended cloak, each straw-stuffed shoe bore witness to resilience. They told a story not of wealth or beauty, but of persistence, the will to endure through cold winters, harsh summers, and unrelenting scarcity. Thus, when we imagine the clothing of medieval peasants, we must not see rags alone. We must see survival stitched into every seam, the rhythm of the seasons etched into every patch. Their garments were not mere coverings, but living symbols of adaptation, ingenuity, and the human spirit's determination to face the turning year with courage. When we think of medieval peasants, The image that often comes to mind is one of hardship, figures bent with labor, dressed in coarse, patched clothing, struggling through the relentless cycles of work and survival. Yet, hidden within these humble lives, was a quiet ingenuity that left a legacy far greater than it first appears. The clothing of peasants, though plain and often dismissed as rags by wealthier eyes, tells a story of adaptation, resourcefulness, and creativity. It was not merely about covering the body, it was about solving problems, making do with little, and transforming scarcity into opportunity. At the heart of this ingenuity was the practice of mending. Every tear, every fray, every worn seam became an opportunity for repair. Peasants developed remarkable skill with needle and thread, often passed down through generations. Mending was not just an act of necessity, it was an art of survival. A tunic could be patched so many times that the original fabric was nearly gone, replaced with layers of scraps, each telling its own story. These patched garments became mosaics of survival, living testaments to resilience. In many ways, the peasant's cloak or tunic was a canvas, bearing witness to the endless cycle of wear and renewal. Beyond mending, peasants also mastered the art of repurposing. Nothing was wasted. A cloak too worn for the fields might be cut into smaller garments for children, a frayed hood might become an apron, a sack, or even bandages. Leather shoes once cracked and broken could be stripped for laces, or used to patch another pair. Every scrap of fabric found a second life, and often a third. This practice of reuse reflected not only necessity, but also a mindset that valued ingenuity over waste. In a world where resources were scarce, the ability to see possibility in the smallest scrap was itself a form of wisdom. Innovation also found its way into the materials peasants used. While the wealthy wore fine silks and dyed wools, peasants relied on what the land could provide. They made rough wool from their sheep, linen from flax, and simple dyes from plants, roots and bark. The ingenuity lay not only in producing these materials, but in adapting them to local conditions. In colder climates, wool garments were made thicker, layered to trap heat. In warmer regions, lighter linens were woven to provide breathability. Peasants did not think of these choices as innovation, but in reality, they were early forms of sustainable design, born out of intimate knowledge of the land. Peasant clothing also demonstrated ingenuity through its multifunctional design. A cloak, for example, was not only a garment, it was a blanket on cold nights, a cover against rain, even a sack to carry grain or firewood. Belts held more than garments in place, they carried knives, tools, and pouches. Hoods shielded the head from rain, and doubled as storage pockets. These garments blurred the lines between clothing and tool, becoming versatile solutions to daily challenges. Every item served multiple purposes, reducing the need for more possessions and lightening the burden of survival. Another legacy of peasant ingenuity was communal sharing. Clothing was often exchanged between families, repurposed across generations, or gifted during times of need. This culture of sharing meant that garments carried stories far beyond the individual. They became collective memories of the village. A patched tunic might once have belonged to a grandfather, then passed to a son, and later to a cousin. The ingenuity was not only in making garments last, but in weaving them into the fabric of community life. Clothing bound people together, embodying trust, care, and cooperation in the face of hardship. Even in the smallest details, ingenuity appeared. To preserve warmth in winter, peasants stuffed shoes with straw or moss, an early form of insulation. To strengthen weak seams, they stitched with double thread or reinforced with leather strips. To extend the life of dyes, they mixed natural mordants like alum or vinegar. Some even discovered clever ways to make garments water-resistant, rubbing them with animal fat or oils. These were not luxuries but practical experiments, learned through trial and error, shared through oral tradition, and adapted to the conditions of each family. The ingenuity of peasants also had an emotional and symbolic dimension. Their garments, though humble, carried pride. To keep a cloak alive for 10 winters was a mark of skill. To pass down a tunic to one's child was an act of love. Clothing became a language of resilience, proof that a family could endure the relentless tests of nature and time. In this way, ingenuity was not only practical but cultural. It defined the identity of peasants as survivors, creators, and custodians of tradition. The legacy of peasant ingenuity extended far beyond the medieval era. Many of the practices developed out of necessity, mending, repurposing, sharing, sustainable use of local materials, are echoed in modern movements that value thrift, sustainability, and resilience. What was once dismissed as poverty is now often celebrated as wisdom, the ability to live with less, to waste nothing, to honor the resources of the earth. In this sense, the peasants left behind not rags but lessons, timeless insights into how humans can adapt and endure. We might think of ingenuity as something tied to invention or great discoveries, but in truth the quiet innovations of ordinary people are just as significant. The peasants who found ways to stay warm with scraps of cloth, who turned sacks into garments, who made dyes from roots and herbs, they too were innovators. Their creativity, born of struggle, carried them through the harshest of winters, the hardest of famines. It also shaped a cultural memory of resilience, showing that survival depends not only on wealth but on the human spirit's capacity to adapt. In the dim cottages of medieval villages, by the flicker of firelight, mothers taught daughters to stitch, fathers taught sons to mend shoes, and children learned how to make do with what was available. These small acts of teaching carried forward the legacy of ingenuity. Each generation inherited not only garments but skills, the wisdom to see opportunity in scarcity, to transform the ordinary into the essential. This legacy, though quiet, is perhaps one of the greatest gifts of the peasant world. To look back on peasant clothing is to see more than fabric and thread. It is to see survival stitched into every seam, resilience woven into every fiber, creativity hidden in every patch. The legacy of peasant ingenuity lies in this truth that even in the harshest conditions, human beings can create, adapt, and endure. Their garments may not have dazzled with wealth or beauty, but they embodied something far deeper, the ingenuity of the human spirit, a resource that never runs dry. As we come to the end of this journey into the world of medieval peasants and their clothing, let us pause and reflect on what garments truly meant in a time so far from our own. To modern eyes, a peasant's tunic, patched beyond recognition, may look unimpressive. A cloak repurposed from sackcloth, or shoes stuffed with straw, may seem crude. Yet when we look deeper, these simple garments reveal a history far richer than gold embroidery or jeweled silks. They remind us that clothing is never just fabric and thread. It is a window into the lives of those who wore it, a living record of their struggles, their creativity, and their endurance. In the villages of medieval Europe, clothing told stories that words could not. Each tear was a story of long days in the fields. Each patch marked the moment when something once considered broken was given life again. Each stitch carried the handprint of a mother, a father, a grandparent, passing on the skill of repair. To wear clothes in that time was not only to shield the body, but to carry a tapestry of memory. These garments, though humble, were repositories of human experience, woven with hardship, mended with hope. Clothing is often seen as a marker of wealth and class. Kings wore crowns. Nobles draped themselves in silks, merchants flaunted dyed wools, but when we look at peasants, we see another kind of richness, one not measured in currency, but in creativity. For the poor, the challenge of survival demanded imagination. A cloak was never just a cloak. It could become a blanket, a shield against rain, or a bundle for carrying firewood. Shoes were not discarded when broken, but adapted, patched or stripped for parts. Every item was made to endure, transformed again and again through the hands of its wearer. In this, clothing became a symbol of resilience. The story of peasant clothing is also the story of sustainability, before the word even existed. In our world today, fast fashion discards garments at the first sign of wear, filling landfills with waste. But peasants lived by an entirely different philosophy. Nothing was thrown away, nothing wasted. Clothing was shared across generations, repurposed until it could no longer serve. Even then, the smallest scraps became rags, stuffing, or ties. What we call upcycling today was, for them, simply the rhythm of life. Through their clothing, peasants remind us that survival is not about abundance, but about using wisely what we already have. When we study the clothing of the past, we also see how deeply intertwined it was with the natural world. The wool of sheep became cloaks, the flax from fields became linen, plants provided dyes, and animal fat served as waterproofing. Every garment was a conversation with the land, a collaboration between human skill and natural resource. Peasants knew the language of materials, when wool needed to be spun thicker, when flax should be harvested, how bark could give a garment a hue of brown or green. Clothing in this way reflected not only necessity, but also an intimate understanding of the earth. But perhaps the most powerful lesson clothing offers is the one about identity. To wear patched garments was not a mark of shame, but of survival. Every patch declared, "This garment lives on, and so do I." Every stitch whispered, "We endure." In a world that offered little mercy, peasants used clothing to weave together dignity from scarcity. Through fabric and thread, they created continuity in their lives, binding past to present, family to family, and community to community. As we imagine a medieval peasant sitting by the fire, after a long day, mending a cloak by candlelight, we glimpse a timeless truth across centuries and cultures. Humans have always turned fabric into more than just covering. Clothes carry memory, embody culture, and symbolize resilience. A garment is both deeply personal and profoundly collective. It is worn on the body, yet it belongs to a larger story of community and survival. Peasant clothing, therefore, is not only about the Middle Ages, it is about us. It asks us to think about how we value what we wear today. It invites us to question whether we see clothing as disposable, or as something to be honored, cared for, and repaired. It challenges us to slow down, to see the stories in our own garments, to imagine what future generations might learn from the way we treat what we wear. In this way, medieval peasants, though long gone, still speak to us. Their patched tunics and cloaks, their straw-filled shoes and linen smocks, offer more than just curiosity. They offer lessons in resilience, resourcefulness, and respect for the world around us. They remind us that survival is not about wealth, but about imagination, not about luxury, but about the will to endure. And so when we look at the clothing of the past, we do not just see fabric, we see the human story itself. We see the hands that spun wool, the children who wore garments passed down, the communities that shared and repaired. We see hardship, yes, but also perseverance. We see loss, but also hope. Clothing becomes a mirror, reflecting not only how people lived, but who they were. As this story draws to a close, picture again the quiet rhythm of the needle moving through cloth, the gentle tug of thread, the sound of fabric being pulled together. In that sound lies the heartbeat of history, steady, patient, enduring. Every stitch was a declaration that life would go on, that families would endure another season, that hope could be sewn even into rags. It is in these small acts, repeated countless times in countless villages, that the legacy of peasants endured. Clothing as a window into the past shows us something simple yet profound, that even in obscurity, human lives matter. Even in poverty, creativity shines. Even in struggle, dignity survives. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that the threads of human history are strongest, not where they are gilded with wealth, but where they are tested by hardship and mended with resilience. And so as you drift into rest, let the image of those patched garments stay with you. Let them remind you that every life, no matter how humble, leaves a mark upon the world. Let them teach you that in every stitch there is strength, in every patch there is persistence, and in every garment there is a story worth remembering. As our journey through the world of medieval peasant clothing draws to its close, we are left with more than just images of patched tunics, straw-stuffed shoes, and hand-stitched cloaks. We are left with lessons, quiet, enduring, and deeply human. For those centuries divide us from those men and women who walked muddy fields and sat by flickering hearths. Their way of life still whispers wisdom into our own restless age. If we listen closely, we may hear what they have to teach us. The first lesson is about resilience. Medieval peasants lived in a world of scarcity. A torn garment was not the end of its usefulness, but the beginning of its transformation. They patched, stitched, rewove, and reimagined. In our world where convenience often overshadows patience, their way reminds us that endurance comes not from having much, but from cherishing what we do have. Their patched clothing was not a sign of defeat, but a symbol of survival. It told the story of a people who endured winters, wars, and famine, not through wealth but through the steady courage of making do. The second lesson is about creativity born of necessity. Today, creativity is often linked to art, innovation, or luxury, but in the medieval village it was woven into daily survival. Turning an old sack into a cloak, weaving nettle fibers into thread, or fashioning shoes from bark, these were acts of artistry, even if humble. They remind us that creativity is not reserved for the privileged, nor confined to galleries or inventions. It lives in the ordinary, in the quiet solving of daily problems, in the ability to see potential where others see waste. Their garments whisper to us, true creativity is resourcefulness. Another lesson lies in sustainability, a word often spoken today, but lived fully in the past. For medieval peasants, nothing was wasted. Wool was spun until the last strand, flax fibers twisted into linen until the plant offered no more, scraps of cloth turned into rags and bindings. In our time of fast fashion, when clothing is worn briefly and then discarded, their way offers us a mirror. They remind us that the earth's resources are not infinite, and that every garment carries within it the labor of hands, the gift of nature, and the weight of time. To mend, to reuse, to respect what we wear, these are not old-fashioned ideas. They are timeless truths. There is also a lesson about dignity. To modernize, patched garments may seem like symbols of poverty, yet for peasants they carried a deeper meaning. To repair clothing was to preserve not only fabric but self-respect. To wear something cared for was to say, I am worth the effort, and so is my family. In this, peasants teach us that dignity is not found in luxury or outward display, but in the quiet care we give to our lives, our homes, and even our clothes. Every stitch was an affirmation of worth, and perhaps one of the most profound lessons is about patience. Repairing clothing was slow work, done by hand, stitch by stitch, in dim light. It could not be rushed. In that rhythm, peasants practiced a kind of mindfulness long before the word existed. Each moment spent sewing was a moment of focus, care, and persistence. In our hurried world filled with constant distractions, their way calls us to slow down, to value process over speed, to remember that life's strength is built patiently, one small act at a time. When we reflect on these lessons, we realize that peasant clothing is more than a detail of history. It is a mirror held up to our own society. We too wear garments. We too face the challenge of survival, though in different forms. And just as their patched tunics told a story of endurance, so too will our clothes one day tell a story of us. What will future generations read in the seams of our garments? Will they see waste, thoughtlessness, and excess? Or will they find, as we find in the past, evidence of care, respect, and resilience? There is also a lesson in humility. Medieval peasants did not live in comfort. Their clothing was not designed for beauty, but for survival. And yet in its very simplicity, there was a quiet beauty, a beauty of purpose, of endurance, of lives lived close to the earth. In remembering them, we are invited to look at our own lives with new eyes. Do we measure worth by display or by substance? Do we honor the unseen labor that goes into every thread, every garment, every act of making? And so what we can learn today is not just about clothing, but about life itself. We can learn to endure with resilience, to create with resourcefulness, to live with sustainability, to carry dignity in small acts, to walk with patience, and to live humbly in respect for the earth and for one another. These are not lessons bound to a medieval village. They are lessons for every age. As you drift into rest, let these lessons linger. Picture the quiet of a peasant home, the glow of firelight, the steady movement of hands sewing a tear. Imagine the patience in each stitch, the resilience in each patch, the hope in each garment, preserved for another day. Let that image remind you that life's strength is found not in wealth or display, but in endurance, care, and love. The clothing of peasants may have been humble, but its story is grand. It speaks across centuries, reminding us that even the simplest fabric carries wisdom, and even the poorest garments are woven with dignity. In their patched tunics and cloaks, we find a message for our own time. Cherish what you have, respect what is made, and remember that survival is a work of quiet resilience. And so as we close this journey, let us carry with us not only the knowledge of how peasants repaired their clothes without needles, but also the deeper truths their lives offer. Let us honor their memory, not by pitying their poverty, but by learning from their strength. And may their lessons guide us toward a life lived with more care, more patience, and more respect for our garments, our earth, and for one another. As you rest, Let their story weave softly into your dreams, a reminder that every thread holds meaning, every stitch tells a story, and every garment, no matter how worn, can carry the weight of human resilience.